Hello and welcome one and all back to the S.E.E.D Truth Academy. Today I'm going to explore a fascinating comparison that might not be immediately obvious to the viewers. The connection between the 1986 sci-fi horror classic Aliens and the timeless fairy tale of Snow White. Right at the beginning of the movie, we find Ellen Ripley, who has been afloat in space for 57 years, still in hypersleep. This parallels the story of Snow White. After Snow White falls into a deep slumber from the wicked queen or the wicked stepmother, the dwarfs in the story cannot revive her from this deep slumber, so they place her in a glass coffin, believing that she happens to be dead. This is slightly different than what we see from the continuation of the first film by Ridley Scott, but the symbolic motif is still the same. Ripley ends up in a deep slumber in a glass coffin where she is ageless until she is awoken by the salvage team of Weyland-Yutani. The hypersleep pods in which Ripley and the other characters rest can be seen as futuristic glass coffins. Like Snow White, Ripley is preserved in a state of suspended animation awaiting her awakening. The transparency of the pods, much like a glass coffin, signifies vulnerability and a state or sense of being frozen in time. Ripley's awakening from hypersleep at the beginning of this movie marks the start of her new journey, a resurrection or a second birth esoterically. This mirrors not only the esoteric tradition of Freemasonry, but many ancient mystery school traditions. This rebirth parallels Snow White's revival from her death-like sleep when the kiss from the prince arrives. Ripley's awakening thrusts her back into the world where she must confront her past and protect her future, signifying the start of a new chapter in her life, much like Snow White's journey to overcome the wicked stepmother. One of the mystery traditions that I feel is very important to make light of in this situation is the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, because whether intentional or unintentional, Ripley takes up the archetypal form of Demeter. Demeter is the daughter of the deities Kronos and Rhea, sister of the consort of Zeus, the king of the gods, and the goddess of agriculture. Her victory over the first alien in the first film was her symbolic initiation into the higher degrees of the Eleusinian mysteries, raising her up above the ignorance of the world of shadows. A lot of people associate Ripley to Gaia because of the cinematic transition between Ripley's face and the planet Earth. However, I am associating her to Demeter as the generative principle of this story, since Demeter actually represents the generative forces of the planet Earth, being that of the seasons or the changes of the cycles and things like agriculture. And you may ask, well, what does this have to do with the Snow White fairy tale? That is a good question. The question is answered very simply by the ubiquitous nature of bringing back fertility to the land. When Snow White is resurrected and she has her alchemical wedding, the land is then healed. The wicked queen and the illness that plagues the land because of her doings is no longer present. Thus, fertility and agriculture is brought back. In the story, after Snow White awakens, she awakens in the dark forest, which I find extremely significant and corresponds to the journey of the heroine Ellen Ripley. Ellen's name etymologically means brightness, illumination, and enlightenment, where her last name, Ripley, etymologically means strip of clearing in the woods or stripped meadow. So she is the one who brings the light into the dark forest, into the woods. She is Snow White, the enlightened one, the one who has achieved the second birth or the resurrection of the self. Her name in green language, or what is also known as the Enochian language or the language of the birds, can be broken down phonetically. L-N. L is the Hebrew word for God, and then if we replace the vowel E with I, we have N, so we have the inner God. So she has achieved the divine state within herself, true self-mastery, one could say. In the original Brothers Grimm story of Snow White, which is a much darker version of the Disney movie Snow White, Snow White is actually awakened by accident. And this parallels with this movie, being that they accidentally find Ripley floating in space. In a similar manner, Ripley denies the call to the hero's journey. When the company comes calling to her, asking her for help with the xenomorphs, she denies them, and it takes her a while to actually acknowledge that she must confront this fear, which also is very similar to Snow White when the huntsman tries to kill Snow White at the order or the behest of the Wicked Queen. He lets her go, and she flees into the dark woods, finding a cottage and then finding the 7 dwarfs. The queen's malicious motive to kill Snow White is dependent upon her vanity, very similar to the narcissist mythology. She has a magic mirror who she asks, "Who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror always replies that she is, until one day it names Snow White as the fairest of them all, which enrages the queen. The queen orders the huntsman to take Snow White into the forest and bring her heart as proof. This is symbolic of bringing the heart of true care as a sacrifice. The huntsman cannot bring himself to kill Snow White. Instead, he lets her go and brings back the heart of a wild animal. And in some versions, especially the original Brothers Grimoire, it was supposed to be a liver and a lung, where the queen eventually eats either the heart, liver, and lung. Now, there are 2 depictions of the dwarves and the huntsman in this Alien movie. Now, we have to understand that the motifs kind of overlap because it's not a direct correlation or a direct adaptation of the Snow White story. On one level, Newt can be seen as an amalgamation of the dwarfs who protect Snow White. She is small, resourceful, and has managed to survive in a very hostile environment, being that of the Wicked Queen's dark forest. But on another level, the Colonial Marines could also be seen as the dwarfs. The dwarfs seen as the guardians and protectors of Snow White parallel the guardianship and protectionship, or at least the attempt by the Marines, although we find out in the movie that Ellen Ripley ends up protecting them. The alien queen, or xenomorph queen, in this movie Aliens, parallels the wicked stepmother, embodying the monstrous version of the archetype. She is driven by a primal instinct to protect her brood, much like the queen is driven by vanity and jealousy. The alien queen sees Ripley as a direct threat to her offspring. Ripley has to make the journey to confront the queen in an attempt to rescue Newt from the alien hive. The alien hive obviously represents the dark forest in the story of Snow White. It is the journey into the abyss. The hive serves as a crucible where Ripley's character and the Marines are tested and ultimately transformed due to this turbulent and horrific experience into the hive. This correlation of Ellen Ripley is not just a synchronistic one, but it is very intentional, being that we see Vasquez refer to her as Snow White in the film.
Mira, who's Snow White?
This final battle between Ripley and the Xenomorph Queen can be seen as the symbolic accumulation of the story, akin to Snow White's wedding. In the fairy tale, Snow White's wedding marks the ultimate triumph over the Wicked Queen, who is forced to dance in red, hot iron shoes until she dies, a brutal end for her brutal character. This to me signifies the use of the flamethrower that is attached to the pulse rifle that Ripley uses to kill off all the xenomorphs and alien eggs in the hive. Although in this movie, the Wicked Queen, the Xenomorph Queen, has one last attempt to kill Ripley, where Ripley has to fight it off with an exoskeleton loader suit. Ellen Ripley's wedding is not only to Commander Hicks, where she removes his locked heart, symbolically shown on his armor, to help save him from the acid of the xenomorphs, but also it is the internal psychological representation of her integration and her union of her sacred masculine principle. She embodies not only the sacred feminine aspect of care and nurture to protect Newt, but also manifests that into action, or I should say right action and wisdom, by embodying the sacred masculine principle or energy within herself. This is the union of opposites, or the alchemical wedding. I find that the last conflict in this movie between Ellen Ripley and the Xenomorph Queen is a great representation of the truly activated and awakened female versus the unholy, socially engineered, epidysgenics female of the current modern world. It is a battle between maternal instincts, one of a darker aspect being the xenomorph and the other being of the light, being Ripley protecting the innocence of Newt. Ripley's use of the exosuit to battle the Queen at the end scene emphasizes her triumph through human ingenuity and determination. The Dark Queen, is then sent into her abyss, which is being ejected into space, which parallels the Wicked Queen's punishment in Snow White, where the descent into the abyss or the underworld symbolizes the eradication of evil and the purging of corruption. In mythological terms, the abyss often represents chaos, and by casting the Queen into it, Ripley restores order to her world. So this final scene is the symbolic alchemical wedding, and to achieve this union, not only within oneself, but to manifest that union into the physical world, one has to be able to embody both the sacred feminine and sacred masculine principles. And by going down this path, one invokes a rite of initiation or rite of passage. This ritualistic battle between Ripley and the Queen ultimately is seen in many fairy tales, and this battle represents the ultimate test of the hero or the heroine in order to restore not only morality, but also order within the world or that environment. So this symbolic correlation of this film allows us to understand that this movie, Aliens, is not just a horror action film, but a modern myth where ancient symbols and themes are reimagined in a futuristic setting, but invokes the same motifs and principles of ancient fairy tales. So that's all the time we have for today, folks. Thank you so much for joining me on this short little breakdown of the esoteric correlation of Snow White to the film Aliens, specifically Ellen Ripley. I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I'm going to continue to do more content like this, and I have some new stuff coming out here very soon, especially with the Beyond the Forbidden Veil series. Episode 2.1, Psychological Warfare and Subversive Use of Sacred Symbolism, will be out very shortly. Thank you again. Agape and Namaste to all of you beautiful spiritual beings of the world.